Well, we just heard a really good panel on some of the fabulous technologies that are going to make on-demand air mobility a reality. But to actually make that happen, make it happen for the traveling public, it's going to require both the regulators to develop a means of certifying the vehicles and air traffic controllers who are going to be that operational interface between the vehicles getting integrated into our existing system. So we've got another great panel from the more the regulatory and operational side here with us. Jens Hennig's going to lead that. And Jens, again, comes to us from General Aviation Manufacturers Association. He's got his title of Vice President of Operations, a distinguished set of panelists, as I said, to share their thoughts with. At GAMA, Jens is responsible for their activities of safety, security, and operations. He's their primary staff person on air traffic modernization and the issues affecting manufacturer flight operations. Jens has served on a number of rulemaking committees here in the United States, as well as he's been a member of EASA's Flight Standards Committee since its formation. That's the place where Jens and I first met, is over working with EASA. He's been with GAMA since 2003, so a warm welcome to Jens and his panel.
Thank you, Terry. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the past, a little bit of time in the present, and then look to the far term here with our regulatory friends. And I took a couple of quick notes from the last panel. The idea is, let's listen to industry, and now let's see what the regulators can do to help us move forward. So Maureen, Rick, Mike, and then Jeff, that's the order we're going to go through, and we're going to start kind of a trip down the past. What have we all learned over the past 10 years when it comes to the introduction of some of these new vehicles? The last panels with demand is obviously still in the future, but UASs have certainly been front and center. So Maureen is going to be first up here. Maureen's title is, she is the Director of ATO Operational Concepts, Validation, and Requirements. Prior to that role, she was over at the JPDO, which we all remember fondly, doing some of the early next-gen work. And she has also been participating in a number of FAA acquisition programs tied to the NAS. Education, bachelor's degree in information and system science from Stockton State College. So Maureen, if I look at 333 exemptions, early beyond visual line of sight test operations, toys, what is the ATO's experience with the past 10 or so years when we've started seeing these early operations occurring?
So it's kind of been an interesting ride, because I started with UAS probably back in 2010, 2011. And it was mentioned that at that time, we were looking at really the large integrated ones. I mean, Class A airspace, and what do we have to do to our automation systems in order to kind of get them up to snuff to be able to handle those situations. That was pretty much overridden by the whole small UAS realm that came in and said, okay, these are our ankle biters right now, something that we really have to address sooner rather than later. And maybe that was a good thing, because in looking at some of what we thought were requirements for our large automation systems for that integration space, the large, now in looking at it, we're kind of looking at it from a different perspective. Does it really require information in those large systems, or is it really just getting the right information to a controller given something like a contingency operation? So that was actually a good pause that says, you know, maybe we have much cheaper solutions that we can get out there sooner because we've had to pause on that. Now, getting into the work on the smalls, we have, I think everybody was pretty much aware that we got caught a little short with the whole 107 rule, and what are we going to do about actually handling phone calls into all of our facilities and the number of expected phone calls, and what are we going to do about that? So we quickly kind of jumped onto the bandwagon and said, what are the solutions to that? And it came down to some automation. You know, what kind of functions could we automate in order to alleviate that pain? Which was a really good experiment, because we found out that yes, there are functions that you can automate. And so we'll be looking for more and more of that as we try to integrate some of these other capabilities into the system. I will say that the other thing that we are really focused on is being able to take smaller steps rather than great leaps. You know, getting our feet wet in what are we trying to do and what might look good. Fine, you can make that one exception, but those exceptions take a lot of resources in order to really research and come through with. So we don't want to be in that mode. We want to get into that whole common framework where we're looking at a structure where you know, we have a collective set for certain types of concepts that we'll be able to follow, so that it's not exception-based. And we truly believe that we still need more analysis, especially in the introduction of urban air mobility and the more complex airspace, that we have to do a lot more what we're calling R&D, but maybe it's really some heavy-duty simulation that says, you know, how can we integrate these operations? We don't really want to have to talk to them all. I mean, it's really a matter of how much can go on in a much more automated fashion, and then what are the exceptions that would come under that. So we'll be kind of kicking off some of that analysis that says, you know, what would we really, how can we really see these much greater volumes operating in the complex airspace that they're asking for.
Thank you, Maureen. Next up, Rick Domingo. I was going to say the new Executive Director of Flight Standard. I don't know if new still applies, but you certainly are holding down the role. Rick has been with the FAA since the 1990s.
Yes.
Started out in Boise, moved up the chain out in some flight standards divisions out west. And I think your last detail was acting AVS leadership there. Rick does come with industry background, which we always do appreciate. If I read your resume right, you spent some time in the 121 air carrier community and also helicopter EMS, and I think we might get back to that a little bit later. But if you look back at flight standards, I would assume that for a while there, I think 800 was spending all their time doing 333 exemptions. The entire staff was detailed on a single project, just churn them out. You did the 107 rule. What have you learned from the past 10 years? What were the big challenges?
So thanks, and thanks for inviting me here to speak about these subjects that I think are important to you all. So I don't think I'll go back to as far as 10 years ago, because I think a lot of activity has been recent. When we propagated the small UAS rule, I think that was a watershed event for us and the FAA. And like Jens mentions, AFS 800 was the organization within flight standards that was processing a lot of the 333 exemptions to get operational. That was a cultural, I'll use the term shock, but I'll more use the practical side of it. It was a hard pull for staff at headquarters and also out in the field to understand how to integrate these unmanned systems into the NAS. We were trying to look at, you know, what exactly the requirements were to have safe operations, and also looking at the complexity and the diversity of the products that were coming in and wanting these exemptions, both over those particular rules in Part 107. They're allowed to be exempt. There are some things that you're not. We can't waive, but there was a lot of rules in 107 we could. And so what that did to us, it challenged our mindset within flight standards on how to actually integrate these systems into there, knowing that we didn't have a lot of knowledge around these systems. We didn't have the knowledge around how these systems would work, and clearly we didn't have a lot of knowledge of how we could migrate those into existing rules that we had. I think that was a very important piece for us to understand that. As we propagated the small UAS rule, there are a lot of folks, and also a lot of people on the Hill didn't think we were moving fast enough. And so here we come online with the IPP, Integrated Pilot Program. I think that forced us into an area of, okay, we're not moving fast enough, so how can we move faster, but yet just as safe? And I think within the last year, we issued the first 135 certification to Wing. Back in, I think, if it wasn't the last part of April, the first part of May. They're still not operational yet. That's by choice. I think they're still doing a lot of outreach to the communities. But that was a watershed event for us to actually get a single pilot operation online in the 135 arena with small UAS. And as part of the IPP applicants, there's 7 more that'll probably get to that point in time by the end of this fiscal year. At least that's my understanding. all with unique operations. But I think that's proven to both ourselves and the industry, we can get operationally for a lot of these proposed operations. But a lot of that comes with understanding the specific CONOPS for each applicant, because I think that's the important piece, to kind of know the scope of the operations. Where they're going to operate is another factor that we consider. And as we get operational, one of the tenets that we have is to collect data and understand the operations, both prove that the operator can actually fly in these arenas, and also that the equipment is reliable to a point, to the point of safety, and then we can look at opening up their operations a little bit more. And so you also understand that we have the 3 rules that are out there right now. They're all closed for comment: ops over people, the safe and secure, and the external markings. We still have yet to get the remote ID out there. That's still within the building, I believe. Last thing that I remember, or I was briefed on. So all those rules are coming to the head. The remote ID is the big rule for our security partners. And I think once we get that online, you're going to see a lot more type of operations satisfying the government agencies that are concerned about these type of operations.
Thank you, Rick. Dr. Mike Romanowski, aircraft certification. Let's start with your background. You started in the industry side as well, Pratt & Whitney, Sikorsky. Then some time here in DC with the Aerospace Industry Association as VP of Civil Aviation. Then a detour over to the White House. And you've spent the past few years in civil space, and now finally head of standards for aircraft certification. So you've certainly been in some interesting positions and dealing with some new entrants in the past.
Yeah.
If you narrow yourself down to just aircraft cert, past 10 years, UASs, what has the organization learned from that part of the challenge that you've had?
Well, thanks, Jens, and thank you, Terry, and thank you all for staying out to the end of the day here. I'm impressed to have a full room at the end of the day, so well done. First, I think Rick and Maureen both hit on this, but the agency today is not the same agency it was last year, 2 years ago, 3, 5 years ago. It's fundamentally changed how it's working together and working across lines, and the approach we're taking. You see it on a daily basis in terms of how we're pursuing solutions. I think the experiences we've talked about with UAS, with IPP, and other activities really have shown us a path forward to leverage what we have available to us to actually make the improvements and facilitate the introduction, the safe introduction of these capabilities. There are a number of components coming into the certification aspect of this. A couple of years ago, we released a rewritten Part 23 small airplane requirements, regulations. That's a profound change that fundamentally altered the landscape, and I think has actually enabled a lot of what we're seeing with urban mobility, as well as a whole host of innovative technologies and solutions coming to the market. What it did was it focused away from the prescriptive regulatory framework, and it really focused on safety outcomes. And that, coupled with the ability to leverage voluntary consensus standards, really is a sea change in how we're looking to certify products. And I think that permeates across how the agency is looking at problems now. We're really focused much more on the safety outcomes. Rick wouldn't have been able to do what he and his folks have been doing without focusing on safety outcomes versus the prescriptive text. So that is a massive change and a lesson learned over the last 10 years. I think the other thing we're looked at is, I mentioned integration, but if we look at how we're coming together and really looking at risk, not in silos of vehicle risk, operator risk, air traffic risk, we're really looking at integrated risk. That's key to the way we've moved forward with unmanned aircraft systems. It's key how to what we're looking at urban mobility. And one of the things, I'm going to step back into the space experience, but we did break some ground there when we started looking at the integration of space risk calculations with aircraft risk calculations for launches, effective launch and reentries, to minimize the impact on the airspace while still protecting the flying public. So there was some groundbreaking work on integrated risk analysis done there, but we're leveraging that now both in in our internal processes, but also international processes with things like JARS and SORA in terms of how we're looking at risk. So that's game changing. And I think the other thing we've learned, and it's really something that I talked about up front, but it comes back, bears repeating, we find that the regulatory framework we have, although it might not be the most efficient framework for doing what we're doing with these new applicants, it works. And it's entirely adequate to certify these new types of vehicles, new technologies, and their associated operations. You know, we have to maybe think and work a little harder to make that happen in that framework, but it's there and it's available for us to leverage.
Thank you, Mike. All right, Jeff Richards, co-lead for unmanned aircraft systems for the National Air Traffic Controller Association, and a 27-year controller out of Chicago, I understand. And you get the same question, but you have been maybe closer to the day-to-day of seeing these vehicles starting to fly around. Maybe you haven't seen them, but you've at least been told about them there, that somebody is seeing something flying. What's your experience there down in truly dealing with the airspace on a day-to-day basis with new entrants?
I'm sorry. Thank you, and thank you, RTCA, for having us here. My interaction operation, it was probably pretty limited until I was brought onto the team. When Steve and I came on about 4 or 5 years ago, they put us into the AJV 115 office. And we've been working in that office, trying to identify issues that might arise once something makes it out to the field where the rubber meets the pavement and the actual air traffic controllers have to start using some of these systems. The best example of this was, as Maureen mentioned, was the land system. That's fantastic. They got so many authorizations, if you will, that were given for such a small amount of issues on the backside because we were involved, because we held hands all the way operationally in the field and helped that system come out very smoothly. So it's been a fantastic ride, really, for 4 or 5 years. I'm really looking forward to see what the next 10 years brings.
Very good. Thank you. All right, that was the past. Now I want to switch to at least the beginning of the future. You've heard on the industry panel that there are some different operational concepts. We won't solve them all, but for purpose of the discussion, we're going to start with urban air mobility, a little bit more traditional because we'll still have a pilot up front. We know that some of the vehicles out there, there will be somebody flying it, at least in the near term. So if we start there, and then later in the panel, we'll get into the more futuristic. Let's talk about that framework. So I'll circle back to you, Maureen. Single pilot operations. I'm always intrigued that people don't know that there are single pilot operations going on a regular basis all through the NAS, coming from the GA side. This is what we do. And we do it in some pretty sophisticated aircraft. Helicopters, business jets, we get up there. But it's fair to say that understanding of the limited knowledge, it's probably fair to say the NAS is built for a different side of crew in certain situations. From the ATO's perspective, if you start seeing, let's call it larger volumes of single pilot operations in an urban environment, what do you need? What are the challenges? What's your experience today with single pilot operations?
Right, so the thing to keep in mind here is ATO is not just about the air traffic control controllers, but it's also all of the NAS systems, the automation systems, the navigation systems, the comm systems. And as the volumes of these single pilot operations increase, we really have to be very cognizant about what the potential impacts could be on all of the NAS systems across the board. So, you know, once again, it's really a matter of definitely in favor of single pilot operations growing before we go to autonomous operations, because that's more of a, at least as far as the technology is concerned, you know, there's a little bit of comfort there. But at the same time, it kind of gets back to what I was saying in the beginning about we really have to look at and do some testing about what does increased volumes really mean in already dense airspace? I mean, and in that case, we would be able to maybe run through a bunch of things and see whether there's got gaps in policy or technology that we really need to fill before we can move on from there. So even there's still a pilot available, we're still looking for more of that, we'll call it a crawl, but maybe it's not quite crawl. Let's not jump into highly complex operations before we have an opportunity to really shake it out a little bit and see whether there are adverse impacts to any of the NAS systems that are out there.
Okay. Rick, over to you. On the flight standards side, you are responsible for authorizing these operations to be done. Let's throw out a hypothetical, a commercial operator doing some type of vertical operation in the metropolitan area somewhere in the United States. Some of these vehicles look like helicopters. You have a helicopter experience in the HEMS industry. It was done before, right? Are there challenges that flight standards are going to face for this higher, larger volume of operation if you start seeing that, as opposed to the one-off live flight going through a terminal area?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jens, and I think from our perspective right now, you're right, these type of operations have been there in one way, shape, or form or another, just not at probably the potential and the pace and the cadence that this may open up for us. So for us, it's the three areas as well. Maureen talked about the airspace, it's the aircraft piece as well, and then the airmen that are operating the aircraft. But I think another component that we need to look at in these type of operations is the operating environment. You're going to be possibly in a high densely populated urban environment, very well could be, which means all the considerations for seeing a void by the pilots that are on board as we take that first step is a challenge. And also communicating between aircraft, knowing where they are in these urban environments, that's going to be a huge piece for us. Big safety concern that we have. And so the piloting skills, of course, operating these type of aircraft that have, I won't say autonomous, but they have highly sophisticated systems on board, which may help pilot workload. I think that's an important aspect that may be mitigating to a point. Understanding how those systems work and understanding what happens if the systems kind of fail, that'd be the aircraft cert piece of it, is important for us as well. I don't see obstacles that we won't be able to get operational. I just see the pace of how we get there is a concern for us. And we don't know a lot about it right now, about how we're going to do that. I think that's what we need to discover, understanding the systems on the airport or aircraft. And by that I mean there's probably going to be a lot of sophistication and uniqueness of the type of aircraft that are coming in there, as I looked at some of the designs already. And as aircraft search starts looking at the design and what needs to be in that design for reliability, that's going to be a big portion of how flight standards adopts these into the operations. That's nothing new to us. That's something that we do today. But again, it's the pace that we do it at that is going to be a concern for flight standards.
Thank you. Dr. Mike,
Yeah.
I was going to ask you what you thought about the current cert standards, and you just used the word adequate a few minutes ago. So you can revisit that if you want to. 23, 27, 29, 2117B for those of us geeking out truly. Yeah. Are they adequate for the single pilot space? And I think, are there more things to look at that if you truly see that high volume? But also maybe a twist to that question, building on what Rick said. Is there an operational evaluation component earlier in the cert program what we may do with traditional aircraft from your perspectives?
Yeah, I think let me come at it from that point of view of how do we actually certify these vehicles, right? Under what framework? As I said, I think we do have the flexibility to appropriately certify them. What we are doing though is we are working much more closely with flight standards early in the process. And there are key things in those vehicle designs that we want to make sure we've got the flight standards input and factor that into how we're going about the certification. And by that I mean, again, I think we're working with somewhere around 20 different companies on various different their design concepts. Every one of them is different in terms of how they're choosing to take advantage of all the new technologies, new capabilities that are available today. What we're looking at, some look like airplanes, Some look like helicopters. Some look like something you've never seen before. But very few of them very clearly are true. You know, this is a pure aircraft. This is a pure helicopter. They're somewhere in between, and we really are going through that exercise of what is the appropriate category to put them in the regulatory framework. What really helps us out is the Part 23 rewrite, in that it's giving performance capabilities, and that level sets us across the span, whether it's a 23, 27, or a special category. We're able to look at that safety continuum. We're able to look at the unique features and bring in the appropriate requirements from each of those parts and from the engine propeller type standards as well, and determine a certification basis that's more than likely to be unique for each of those aircraft because of their unique features. What is central, though, is do we call that a small airplane certification, or do we call that a special category certification? Very few of these probably fit into a helicopter certification. And the reason for that is the vehicles are being designed with unprecedented levels of redundancy, fail-safe. They're being designed with totally different crew interfaces, simplified vehicle operational concepts, levels of assistance to the pilot that have unique flight controls now. So what we're looking at, and this is where we're really looking to flight standards to help us out in terms of making that decision, what is the most effective way to get these vehicles not just certified, but operational, is what is the path for the pilot qualification and the training requirements to make sure they have their necessary standards. If it's more effective for us to use a special category certification, then that's what we'll do. If it's more effective for us to use the airplane certification and it meets the basic definitions of an airplane, then that's what we'll do. But the idea really is to introduce the most effective basis so that the operation can be more streamlined and fewer unintended consequences down the line.
Thanks, Mike. I'll actually hit up Rick on a follow-up on that one. You have a group called the Aircraft Engineering Group, AEG. Maybe not the most well-known part of flight standards, but it sure is important to us manufacturers. I know you're reorganizing that entity as part of other activities, but are they ready for the challenge? You know, new flight control systems, vehicles that they haven't seen before. How are they engaged with their colleagues in aircraft certification so far?
So it's the aircraft evaluation group.
Evaluation
Is what
group,
it
my
used to
bad.
be, and it's so. I think what Michael said earlier about the integration now that is continuing work that was under the SOC ARC and now continuing under SOCAC, where flight standards and aircraft cert in the early stages are more aligned and more together, even understanding original CONOPS to understand what the nature of the operations. I think that's helping us get to the point where even through the design side, if we're understanding what the design is going to do and we can be in that conversation early, that impacts the operational side. That may help shape how we get these products operational quicker. So the AEG is going to be part of that process as well, because not only do they do an interface with aircraft cert during the, call it the type cert process, whatever we want to call it, they also do the pilot training requirements and produce the documents to not only do that, but also maintain the aircraft as well. So I think they're prepared. It's to do it. It's the technology that is in question about, how that technology now is going to mitigate pilot workloads or help pilots. It won't be decision making. We know that because we're not at AI yet. I know that's probably in the future. We get to a point in states like that. But for right now, it's primarily going to be the workload for the pilot and how that is offset by technology, including the simple type of operations. As I said earlier, there's the diversity of products that could come online as part of this effort is going to be pretty diverse. And we're going to take baby steps. What that means is we have an interest, and we talked about this at the UAS Symposium earlier this week, and the acting administrator made this in his keynote speech about we are interested in getting operational. And whatever that takes to get to that point in time, we're going to do it. We're going to do it safely. And we're going to do that collaboratively with industry. This isn't going to be the FAA working this alone, because we can't.
Right.
And I think, at least what I've been messaging out there is this is a team approach now. This is truly a team sport for the FAA, as Mike talked about earlier, and I'm sure with our ATO colleagues as well. We're all involved early on now, where it used to be a kind of a linear progression of once we get done with it, or once aircraft cert got done with, they'd ship it to flight standards. And that's the first we would kind of understand those operations. That culture is done and over. We can't operate like that anymore. So I think the benefit we're seeing, and in fact, us being here at this conference here just proves that we are in this together from the start. And I think that's probably going to get a lot of return on investment for us.
Thank you.
Jens, can I make an additional point to build on what Rick was just saying there? One thing we're fundamentally doing differently is we embark on certifying these vehicles is certainly 10 years ago, 5 years ago, up to a couple of years ago, when a company had a new project or new program, we would say, submit your application for certification. We will then weigh our resources and then send you a letter when we're ready to start talking about that project. And that was after the certification was application was already in, and which meant the companies were pretty far down the line. We have fundamentally changed that. Now what we're encouraging companies to do is come see us and meet with us and work with us as early as possible in the course of their concept development, in the course of their vehicle development. And we're seeing the benefits, and I think the industry is seeing the benefits of getting much more clarity up front. So we're able to identify the critical issues that need to be addressed in the certification program and that path to operations. We're able to bring in other parts of the agency into the discussion earlier. And so our goal is to actually have that certification basis effectively defined before they apply. So all of the upfront heavy lift has been done early in the program, and then it's a matter of executing the program that was laid out, which is different than how we've been doing it. And I think that's going to be much more effective for everybody.
All right, rounding out the present, Jeff, back to the single pilot question that I asked Maureen. As a controller, what are the challenges, just real world, especially in the urban environment for dealing with maybe a helicopter doing a specific mission, single pilot or whatever else you don't see?
Right. So helicopter operations are typically segregated. They're not necessarily mixed, certainly at your large Core 30 airports. There's a way to get in and out of the airport with a helicopter, and it's not down the center line of the runway. So those operations, while single pilot, don't pose any additional workload on the controller other than where they need to go and what they need to do. In the future, if you have more and more air mobility type stuff, it starts to clog that pathway, yes, it's going to pose some more issues. But as far as single pilot operations, I would say from the controller's perspective, there isn't we don't slow down for a single pilot operation, at least nothing that's cognitive, that we recognize. So I would say it's not going to be an impact for single pilot operation, just looking at the single pilot piece. These guys do a fantastic job, I guess, with getting the aircraft certified to fly single pilot so it operates in the system properly, as one would expect. I think the bigger issue is going to be getting these folks from wherever they take off into the system, because now we have kind of a stopgap measure. Most of these airplanes are coming off of airports and stuff. If we start coming off of all kinds of different spaces, how are they going to get access, at least into the ATM system, not even looking at PK's vision of UTM, but into our ATM system? That's going to be the issue. How are they going to get these clearances? Because they're not going to be able to just pop up VFR and say, hey, I want a clearance, blah, blah, blah. That won't fly very long.
Very good. All right, thank you. That's it for the past and the present. Now for the future. And up on the screen, you have some ways to ask questions. We'll switch to the future, which is I termed it highly automated or fully autonomous operations. You've all seen the really, really great videos coming out from different companies. We'll do some salted questions here and then open up the floor either for RTCA staff or for you to grab a mic. So Maureen, back to you again. You get the floor first again. I've heard about this concept UTM. Is it applicable? How does it work? What's the ATO organization's view of its role? Maybe for the passenger version, but where does it stay in terms of unmanned or autonomous operations in the NAS?
Right. So as it stands today, I mean, we can't say that UTM is a solution, right? I mean, you know, as we said, we really have to understand all of the implications of what we're trying to do. And part of what I liked hearing, I think it was the previous panel, if not one of the earlier ones, is that we do have common sets of issues, right? And for us to recognize them would be great so that we could kind of start working them off and really understand when we're making some progress. So where we would like to go is to actually pull in these ConOps and really understand where the commonalities are, and then you understand where the common issues between them are, and we can start enabling more and more just because we're going to be attacking more and more of the issues as we go along. This is one of the ways ATO is trying to organize our work right now, is basically, yes, we have definitely signed up to enabling these operations, whether it be small UAS, integrated UAS, or urban air mobility, or even upper E. But there is a lot of work in order to be able to do that. So the more we can really understand how things become one common framework or one structure or how they relate together, then we can say, hey, we're not tackling these problems one at a time. You know, turns out if I handle this issue, then we're handling this issue for 5 different types of ConOps or scenarios or entities. So that's basically where we would really like to try to push these things, is where can we find some common ground so that it's not the one-offs. It's really, we're shooting for what the ultimate solution is. And yeah, the UTM concept could very well be, you know, what we build on, but right now we're still working even through that, where how does UTM interact with ATM? And what are those gray areas, and at what point in time should the UTM system be communicating to the air traffic system so that controllers actually can take some action if they have to, but not get actions when they have no chance of having a positive outcome anyway, right? So there are definitely interfaces to work as far as between UTM and ATM. And before we would just automatically say, oh yes, you know, urban air mobility nicely fits into there, I think we need to work through some of the standards issues and some of the details, resolving some policy issues and whatnot where UTM is needed today. So.
Okay. So future concept, autonomous, fully automated. Rick, in your organizations, is there such a thing as a lead office that I should be knocking on the door and say, hey, I got a business plan, I got money, I got a vehicle, I want to put it into operation? Who do I start with?
Let me think here real quick. So I talked about this with staff before I came to the meeting. And I think I'm going to bridge off of one of the offices that Mike has under his purview. And Mike, it's the one that Peter White's running. Mm-hmm. I can't even...
Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation.
Okay. So we also in Flight Standards are going to have somebody, a point of contact for us. We've just reorganized ourselves, and so we're not standing up a new office or branch to do just that. Mike has that ability. He's already reorged, but we're having a single point of contact. However, it's not going to be a single point failure for us, right? Because I think we've learned here as of late that we've had the right people in certain program positions. However, when that person is gone, we're kind of like floundering. And we can't have that as an organization. So we recognize the need to team with Aircraft Cert and their organizations, putting at least 2, if not 3 people that are working together with with Peter White's office and that branch office to start being the portal to come in from industry, both from, if it's operational side, it'll be our person. If it's Aircraft Cert, it'll be Mike's people. But together, they'll know at the program level of where that project is and how it's coming online. And I think we're hoping to gain some value, and I think we will get some traction on that, because I know it's been a kind of a concern for industry. They don't know who to go to. And once they go into the organization, it gets lost in the organization. We can't have that anymore either. So we've instituted that. In fact, we're standing that up right now. They've already had some initial meetings, making certain that we are aligned with aircraft cert. They're still the lead, at least coming in for the product side. But again, knowing what's going on and understanding what the product design will look like, that's where we're getting involved early on.
Very good. Mike, this new office, talk to me about it. Peter White, he's going to get a lot of emails after this panel.
Peter White's
Peter.White
will be a
at
busy guy.
FA.gov.
Peter is an incredibly capable guy. He previously ran the engine propeller directorate, also our GA alternate fuels office, has a pretty broad history, background and experience. What we did is we brought Peter in to form this office, Center for Emerging Concepts and Innovation. The premise of the office is this is where we're going to do the program management to coordinate and shepherd these innovative aspects of projects or the entire project through into the certification, that pre-certification work, and then hand it off into the ACOs for them to do the actual execution. So what we're doing is we're having a group of program managers there who will be bringing in expertise from across, not just my organization, which covers all of the aircraft, rotorcraft, engine standards and policy branches and systems and avionics and software, all that stuff, procedures and policy, but also reaching, as we said, out to flight standards, over to air traffic or airports, whomever else we need to bring into the table to start working through the concepts and laying out the path. So there's going to be a key program element that they're going to, Mel Johnson, one of my deputies, is in the back of the room there. He has all of our policy folks. So he's going to be supplying the technical experts to the teams working with the companies, laying out the certification basis and means of compliance. We're also building in now a new thing for aircraft certification, and that's systems engineering capability. We're going to be building that into the center so that we can extract common cross-cutting issues, lay out the path for how are we going towards autonomy, how are we going forward with advanced hybrid electric propulsion, how are we moving forward with all new types of game-changing capabilities, recognize what we need to do in research, where Peter's also got a research coordination role for us, as well as feeding those needs and working with Mel and his team to lay out the policy maps and the regulatory path moving forward. So it's a pretty important functional aspect of our organization, and it's going to be powerful for the FAA because it's going to have some legs that take us not just in certification, but as Rick said, to other parts of the agency and working with them. So it's exciting.
On this topic of cooperation, I'll go back to you, Mike, first, but others can weigh in. There's not a shortage of regulators trying to get in on this, and I'm talking about outside these borders. EASA, others have come out with proposals.
Yeah.
I assume it's primarily in the aircraft cert area, but what's your engagement with other regulators, EASA and others who are trying to step into this space in different ways?
We have very close engagement with a number of regulators in this area and the other areas as well. But and that goes everywhere from the discussions at Ali's level with Patrick Key and Earl and Rochelle and at EASA. Mel and I meet very frequently with counterparts at EASA as well, down to the staff level. And what we're doing is looking to where it is effective for us to align our approaches, where do we have the common ground, and then work through and understand where we need to have differences or why, right? Because we have different structures here in the U.S. Our intent is to be able to certify products that are accepted internationally, as is EASA and other regulators. So we're working closely with them. We are actually are working on a couple joint projects where the company has come to us and said, we'd really like, EASA is doing our prime certification, we'd like FAA to work that in parallel and vice versa. So we're working through those types of projects like we do in the more conventional space with the idea that there's a more streamlined acceptance. But we do recognize, I think, that there are things that are uniquely European, there are things that are uniquely U.S. that we have to account for. And most of those tinge on how we handle the operations and some of the, in the operational requirements.
Very good. All right, for the future, Jeff, Maureen discussed some of the concepts, some of them already. There's some question marks around others. You have certainly been engaged with it on behalf of NATCA. What's the official NATCA position on some of these new vehicles, including if you want to delve into the UTM concepts? I know it's being tested in certain places.
Well, the Type A personality controller used to be, you build the vehicle, we'll separate it, right? They're building way too many vehicles now for that to continue. So there needs to be some UTM. Maybe that's not the answer, but something needs to happen in that space that, I'm going to say it, is pretty much unused 500 feet and below. I know the Europeans have already looked at least defining U-space, but I think that we're way ahead of them. They may have a definition for the space, but they still haven't, it's still not an airspace. They haven't changed the airspace any. Whereas we have the land system, we have, ways for folks to get access to that airspace. Some more cumbersome than others, but and I hate to keep coming back to Lance, but it's really a fantastic concept there, and as fast as the FAA pulled it off, getting it out there was incredible. But we just identified airspace that was pretty much unused that we could, give away, and they've created a way to electronically authorize entry into this airspace. We know who's in there, when they're in there, et cetera. So it's, as far as the future, obviously there needs to be some augmented system of separation, I think, and that's in that airspace, because we can't do it. And then as Maureen touched on very eloquently, there needs to be, what's that interface look like? How does that look like? I sit on the ICAO UAS advisory group with Doug Davis, who was here earlier, and that is one of the things we're looking at with the symposium this fall, is trying to say what information needs to transfer between the two systems in order to make it safe.
Very good. All right, we have 10 minutes to go. I have more questions, but let's see if the audience has any questions. I have a very bright light in my face. If there's anybody out there, please look for RTCA staff and a microphone. Anybody want to jump in? I think we have one in the back of the room. Al?
Hi, Steve Horvath with Garmin. So another anniversary 20 years ago this year was when ADS-B was off in the future, and we had an OPIVAL, Wilmington, Ohio, where we had Cargo Airline Association. I was just curious, what kind of actual testing of all the fully autonomous with mixed equipage and all that, is there going to be, are there thoughts about doing that to just see what we can learn from that?
Let me start that, I think. I think if I heard the question correctly, is as we move towards mixed equipage autonomy, how are we are we intending to fully test all those capabilities of vehicle, and I guess over into the air traffic side as well, make that happen. One thing I do want to highlight is most of the things we're talking about over the next few years are in that manned space. Greater degrees of automation, greater crew assistance, and the like in the vehicles. Those, as we said, are pretty much operating in more of a standard method. But one of the things that we are working with NASA on is this idea of an urban mobility grand challenge, where they've laid out a construct for the industry to come work with them on looking at these interface issues. And we're working with them to identify and clearly look at their scenarios and highlight which of those issues really help us as the agency scope out the types of challenges you're talking about. Not focusing on component technologies, but looking at systems integration type issues. How is the vehicle and the operation impacted? How, we have vehicles now looking at auto-detecting safe landing areas. How does that work operationally? How does that work in control with air traffic controllers? How does it work with, Rick talked about sense and avoid. vehicles are being built now with integrated sensor nets that allow them combinations of radars, LiDARs, ADS-B intake, and other information that allow them to get a real sense of what's around them. How does that work in terms of more emergency scenarios or routine operations? So I think there's a path for us to explore those issues, as well as working with them on the companies on an independent basis. And I guess I'd leave it to Maureen or others if they want to comment some more.
Yeah, so number one, it's a great question. There's a lot we don't know right now, at least from my perspective, and I think we're going to learn that. How we even begin to prototype these systems online when they become operational, we have to figure out what that trajectory looks like, what we have to do to at least get you to the place where at least you can feel the product, even prototype testing. That's why I think early on when we're involved with aircraft cert, I think we can help mitigate some of the operational concerns once we understand what that means. And the reason I say that is, I think it was last year I traveled to Australia with then Earl Lawrence was the AUS director, executive director for AUS, and observed operations over there. And it was actually Google that was operating over there. And you know, you can hear about ConOps, you can read about ConOps in a document, but until you actually see the operation and understand what quality and what artifacts are coming out of that operation, once it's operational, that was quite a leap of faith that I accepted once I saw them get operational. And I think that will help us now, at least from my perspective now, leading flight standards. I understand our folks are looking at a lot of paperwork to begin with, and until we get to that initial operating, whatever that phase looks like, that's when we start understanding the nature and how technology is helping us to understand what that's going to take to run that operation, even from a pilot standpoint. Right, at the UAS, and I don't know if this is going to be a question, but I'll just throw it out there now, is at the UAS Symposium, they asked all of us on the panel, those who were up there, about do I need to be a commercial pilot to fly 135 ops for UAS? The answer is no. The answer is the pilot requirements are going to be based on the complexity of the operations, understanding where they're going to operate. That's the going in point. And once we understand what that is, we can tailor the requirements around that. We can tailor it in various ways. We can limit your type of operations to build some confidence in that. And that's not just for the FAA, but that's also for you as an applicant operating these machines. You need to build confidence in how to do it and what you can do. And I think once we start making that those adjustments, how we see that, like we did in this 135 operations, I think we're on our road to operations and not pushing you into a rule that actually doesn't fit, but tailoring the requirements to operate as we see fit.
Very good. Al, other questions out there? You got one?
Ray Young with the New York UAS test site. We've seen 3 rounds of legislation since 2012. The latest one was the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. I wonder if I could just address the question to the panel and ask how this has changed what you're doing in your day-to-day jobs and in planning.
Any takers?
I'll start. So were you referring to a particular part of the REAUTH language or just in general?
In general, of course, I'm interested as a FAA designated test site. We're interested in Section 343 and also in some of the provisions that other provisions, references in the Act which apply to the test sites in terms of our role in supporting the FAA through September of 2023, which is the life in the current legislation.
Okay, so let me start off for the general piece is there were a lot of things in the REAUTH language that were carryovers from before that we, luckily the FAA could take credit for. And then there's also some things in there, and the first one was flight and duty rest times for 135 ops. where they wanted that done within 30 days of the reauth language. So there was those kind of provisions in there. The agency has gone forward and actually, I guess, prioritized what we can do, because right now the agency is limited in our rulemaking initiatives, and that's also congressionally mandated and directional push about what rules we have. You know, the general sense of the rulemaking right now is for every rule we propagate, we got to get rid of 2. So it's kind of 2-for-1 trade-off. It's kind of tough to do that in a regulatory environment when a lot of the rules are propagated from events, right? And so we've been working under that regime now, or that mindset for a little bit now since the new administration has come on. So it's kind of hindering what we can do, so we're prioritizing our work. We actually have a tracking process that we've already reported back to Congress on what we've already missed a lot of our deadlines for obvious reasons. Not the least bit, the government shutdown surely didn't help us either. There were timestamps that came online that affected industry, especially in the 121 world at that moment in time, but we're able to work our way through that. So that's generally around the rulemaking. Now, as I look at the Section 343, I think if any of you were at the U.S. Symposium, there's an announcement being made, unless it was already made. I think it was already made about the grants for these test sites and how much money is being put forward to these test sites. I forget what the actual dollar amount is. Remember what that was, Mike?
I don't.
So the acting, Dan Elwell, acting administrator, made that announcement 2 days ago. So it's that particular announcement is done.
Thank you. I had it right, and I think it was somewhere around 6 million or something like that. I think the dollar amount was, if I remember right. So, not knowing enough about your specific reauth language, although I have it pulled up, words on a paper don't mean a lot to me if I don't understand it to begin with, so I won't even comment on what that is. But I do know with the added funding that we're going to get at these test sites, it's only going to expand the type of operations and expand the expediency that we can look at things at those test sites to get it done, especially with this grant that's coming forward.
Very good. I'll take the discretion as moderator. Last question. It's a twist on what the industry asked on the last panel. Short answers, 10 seconds each. Industry was asked, what did you want from the regulator to support this industry? And it was safety, predictability, and a pathway to operation. At least my notes, that's what I took away. Going down the table here, you're the regulators. What can industry bring to the table to help this materialize?
I'll start. So I agree with all those concepts. In fact, that's kind of the themes that we had back at the US, was all those 3 factors. So what you can bring to the table for us is early engagement. Constant engagement is proving a return on investment for us. And also, the last point on that, because I know it's a quick flash talk, is for us is to be able to explain the why of why we're taking a particular direction. I think it's important for you, and we owe you that. Minimize your assumptions, come to the table with what you know, and if you have any factual data to present to us, I think that helps us, and I know it helps aircraft cert in looking at the original concepts.
Very good. Maureen, Mike?
Oh, I definitely agree with all 3 of them. It was safety, predictability, and what was it?
Pathway to operations.
Yeah, pathway. So, I talked a couple of times about being able to really look at multiple concepts and kind of find the commonality between them. And it's interesting because we have formed a ATO ULT UAS leadership team, which basically is making sure that we have a director level influence on our organizations and actually making some progress, seeing that we're making progress and monitoring ourselves. And I proposed that we be able to focus on, say 2 out of 6 use cases, and they were all like, fat chance, everybody's going to ask for everything at once. So, you talk about pathway, it would really be wonderful if everybody wasn't asking for their own personal thing, and we could, decide what are these common issues and how do we address the common issues so that we can really see ourselves making common progress down the road, not necessarily one single thread that, yet one piece of that is common between them.
All right, Mike, final word for the panel.
Okay. First, I'll echo the other two that said, those three points are, I think, of common interest to us. But I think for the industry coming to us, come in, obviously have a safety mindset, and because that's where we're coming from, and that's really what the public demands. But come early, come engage, early engagement, as Rick said, that's critical to success. Come in with the cooperative mindset on that as well. And then something I mentioned in the start of my remarks, but we never really came back to, and it's appropriate for a group like RTCA, is we really need industry support for the development of the voluntary consensus standards that are going to be instrumental in making this type of system happen. We are geared to the safety performance outcomes, and the voluntary consensus standards really are what make that work.
Very good. All right. Well, I think Terry's going to come up here. In the interim, please help me thank Rick Domingo, Maureen Keegan, Mike Romanowski, and Jeff Richards for this. So thank you.